It is Wednesday, March 19th. This is Landon Blake, ruggedly handsome land surveyor extraordinaire. This is a truck brain dump I'm doing on my drive in to Oakdale this morning. This is another brain dump in our series on GIS. In this brain dump, I want to talk a little bit about the two main data types that we work with in GIS and the hybrids, the crosses between those two main types. So you could basically say there's three. There's the two main types, and then there's the hybrids. There are exceptions to the framework I'm going to lay out in this brain dump. So don't send me hate mail. I'm trying to provide a framework for folks that are just getting started with GIS. And I think this framework helps me, and I think it will help others on my team that are just getting started with GIS to understand a little better. And we'll put this up on YouTube. Hopefully it'll help some other people as well. The two main types of GIS data are vector data and raster data. Let me describe each of the two main types in a little more detail and talk about the hybrids some more as well. So vector data is essentially points, lines, polygons, and combinations of those shapes. Could be 3D or 2.5D, but usually in a GIS context, we're talking about 2D shapes. So these are essentially shapes you could draw on a sheet of paper or on a computer screen. And there's different ways you can represent those shapes. Maybe we'll do another brain dump that talks a little bit about some of the different ways that you can do that. For example, CAD, you tend to do that a little bit differently in CAD than you do in GIS. So in GIS, we have something that's called a line string, and CAD would call that a polyline. So there's a little bit different nomenclature. Some of the underlying ways that data is represented might be a little different. We were talking about this in the basement a week or two ago, and one of my employees said, "Hey, the way I remember it is the villain from, I think it's the second Despicable Me movie. The villain is named Vector." And so he said that's the word association that I use. So a vector is a geometry that can be precisely defined using some mathematical information. Typically, it's just coordinates. It's just a list of coordinates. And it has some advantages over raster data, and it has some disadvantages. One advantage of vector data is that it renders or displays accurately at many different scales. So it's not like a raster where if you zoom in too close, things get fuzzy. Vectors will typically stay sharp as they're rendered by the software program. So if you have what you thought was a vector set of vector data and it gets fuzzy when you zoom in, it's probably been converted to a raster. It's probably been scanned. So vectors will typically stay sharp. Vector data will always appear sharp, even if it's not a good representation of the geometry at a particular scale. That has to do with the resolution of vector data. We'll talk about that in a different way. Don't worry about that for now. Vector data is points, lines, polygons, curves, neat, clean, crisp, precise geometry that we could typically define with the list of coordinates. And that's the type of data that we're working with in CAD most of the time. If you're a CAD user, you'll be familiar with it. The second main type of data that we work with in GIS is called raster data. And that is data that is continuous. So there's typically not gaps or holes. Could be a 3D grid, but usually in GIS, we're working with the 2D grid. At least at our company, at RH, we're working with 2D grids. And the most common form of raster data that we work with is an image. So it's orthophotography. So an image is just a grid, a 2D grid of colors, color values, typically red, green, blue. Maybe there's an alpha channel, which has to do with transparency. That's it. That's what it is. It's just a grid. It's a grid of red, green, blue values. Now, it looks like an image to us because the resolution is so high. There's so many little grid cells of color that to us, it looks like an image. But if you zoom in far enough, you can actually see the individual squares. So why don't we just say images? Why do we say raster data? The reason why is there's other kinds of raster data, not just images, not just orthophotography. So you could represent almost any kind of continuous data as a raster. So you could have a raster where every cell in the 2D grid is the elevation. That's actually a digital elevation model. That's what that is. So a digital elevation model is a special type of raster that represents elevation data instead of color. And we can visualize that elevation model by shading elevations differently with different colors, different shades of a color, single color. But you could use it for groundwater. You could use a raster to represent depth to groundwater or groundwater salinity or soil salinity or soil conductivity. Use it to represent vegetation height or vegetation health. There's an unlimited number of variables that you can represent across a surface or an area with a raster. Now, raster data has some advantages. As I mentioned, there's not usually gaps or holes in raster data. You don't have issues with overshoots and undershoots and gaps and overlaps like you do sometimes in vector data. And you can do different types of what they call map algebra and raster analysis that you can't do with vector data. So for example, you could iterate over a raster and say, and take this raster and in a 10 by 10 by grid, create me a new raster with the average value or with the lowest value or the highest value in the 10 by 10 grid and create me a new raster. And your GIS software, a lot of GIS software will do that. Or you could take one raster that maybe, let's say, represents maybe the acidity of the soil and another raster that represents depth to groundwater. You could say, all right, I want to do some calculations using those two rasters as inputs, and I want to create an output raster that is crop suitability. That's called map algebra. You do that with raster data. It's a little more difficult to do that with vector data. So you can imagine why with vector data, if you had polygons that represented soil acidity and depth to groundwater, those polygons are probably not going to line up exactly 1-to-1. And so you got to figure out how to deal with those differences and deal with any gaps or overlaps in the polygon data. So that's an advantage. Raster data doesn't have that problem. There's inherent advantages in raster data. So let's talk briefly about the disadvantages. We talked a little bit about the advantages. So what are the disadvantages of vector data and raster data? And then we can talk about the hybrids. Disadvantage of vector data is expensive to create typically. So raster data is usually much less expensive to create, especially over large areas. So vector data tends to be more expensive. It has some of those topology issues I talked about, gaps, overlaps, undershoots, overshoots. And you can't perform some of the map algebra and other kind of grid-based analysis that you could perform with a raster. One other advantage that vector data has that I forgot to mention is the data size. The size of the data for a given geographic footprint is typically smaller than it would be for raster data of the same area. Okay, so what are the disadvantages of raster data? So I just mentioned one. File size or data size is one problem. So raster data gets very big very quickly. So as the size of your raster, the width and the height of your raster get larger, your data size goes up exponentially. So file size or data size is always an issue that we are dealing with raster data. And there's some different things we do in GIS to deal with that, but it's a challenge. Let's see what else. Oftentimes, especially when we're talking about image data, there's a lot of information that you can infer from a raster. So you might be able that a human might be able to infer. So a human might be able to look at an aerial image or a satellite image and say, that's a barn, that's a house, that's a road, that's a pasture for cows. But computers aren't very good at that. Now we're getting better at that. The computers are getting better at that with deep learning and other techniques, but they're still not as good as a human. So to really get some of the value out of the imagery data, you have to have a human being go in and extract that data. That's a process that we call feature extraction. And usually that's a raster to vector data conversion process. And that's a lot of what we do as surveyors. We collect a lot of data raster format, and then we extract vector features from that data. So a disadvantage that raster data has is that there's a lot of inferred data, or I shouldn't call it that. There's a lot of data that can be inferred from the raster that isn't directly present in the raw raster itself. And usually you need a human for that inference. I guess another advantage of raster data, you could say in that way, the flip side of that coin is a lot of different types of data can be stored in a single raster, like an image raster. Whereas vector data is typically going to be much more limited in the breadth of data that it can contain for a given geographic footprint. So a satellite orthophoto or a UAV orthophoto for a given area can contain a much broader category of data than a single vector layer for the same geographic area. What are the hybrids? I mentioned those in the beginning of the brain dump. So hybrid is typically a vector data model that acts like a raster, and it has some characteristics of raster data. I think of two hybrids. There may be others, but I think of a point cloud. So that is a dense cloud of points, usually 3D points that we would get from UAV LiDAR or a terrestrial laser scan or sonar data, multi-beam sonar data, or UAV photogrammetry. So those points are the point itself. That's vectors. That's vector data. Those are discrete, crisp points that we can represent with a coordinate. So in that way, it is like vector. But those points can also have a color value or an intensity value. And when you look at a point cloud from the side or the top, it looks very much like an image. So in that way, it's like a raster. They usually have a very large data size. So in that aspect, they are also like a raster. You can do some of the same type of grid based analysis with the point cloud like you can with a raster. So they're a hybrid. They're not purely raster. They're not purely vector. There's something between. The other example I would use is what's called a coverage in GIS. And a coverage is a sheet of connected polygons, typically 2D, that have been processed so that they do not have gaps or overlaps, so that they represent a continuous sheet without gaps of overlaps of connected polygons, typically 2D. Okay, so polygons are vectors. That's vector data, but you can sometimes treat a coverage like it's a grid of raster values, and your GIS software might be able to do that. and it represents a sheet of continuous values, right, that covers an area. That's why it's called a coverage. So that, again, polygons are vectors, but a coverage has some raster-like qualities and can be used in some situations like a raster. So it's a hybrid. In my mind, in my opinion, a coverage, a polygon coverage is like a hybrid. Why do you need to know this? If you're working with GIS, if you're a GIS technician or GIS practitioner, you got to understand what the advantages and disadvantages are of those data sets. You have to understand how to convert in between those data sets, types of data. You got to understand how to be able to overlay those types of data. So all that's important. And when we're going to sit down and think about data acquisition as a land surveying company, if we're going to go out and acquire a highly precise data set, we have to think about what's appropriate for this type of data that we want to acquire. Is a raster appropriate? Is vector data appropriate? Do we want to acquire raster data first and then do feature extraction to end up with vector data? Is a hybrid more appropriate? Do we want to do both? Do we want to do raster data and a hybrid, or raster data and a vector data set, or a hybrid and a vector data set, or all three? Those are some of the questions that we help our clients answer. Those are decisions that we have to make before we go out to do data collection on a project. It's so intuitive for many of us land surveyors that we don't even consciously think about it, but it is a decision that has to be made anytime you're going to go acquire spatial data for a project, especially now that most land surveyors have UAV technology at their fingertips. So we've greatly increased our ability to acquire raster data or hybrid data if we've got UAV LiDAR. And so we have to think about what's the appropriate data collection method given the needs of the client and the needs of the project or the job. And then, of course, when you're planning out your GIS project, you got to think about things like file size and your ability of your computer and your software to work with large data sets. And some of that is going to dictate when you need vector data and when you need raster data. You're not going to zip up a GIS project with a ton of raster data and send it via email to a client. That's just not going to work. The file size are going to be too big. So it is important as a GIS practitioner to understand that the differences in those three basic types of data, vector data, raster data, hybrids, and to understand when it makes sense to create and use those different types of data and how to convert in between them. I'll do another brain dump and I'll talk a little bit about how the conversion between those three different types of data works. And we can talk about fuzziness and data loss and some of the issues that we run into when we try and do conversions between data types. But this is what you got to know. This is part of being a good GIS professional is understanding these things. So I hope this brain dump helps some of my folks, Cosette and Bob and Britt and James and some others that are learning about this, and we'll put it up on the internet. Maybe it'll help some other people as well. Thanks for listening.